Last time on this video, we were talking about the top 10 best SNICK shows. We were talking about the definitive classics. We were reminiscing back on the show that defined SNICK. As you know, a couple of weeks ago, it was the 21st anniversary of SNICK, but now it's all over, and we're going to be talking about the top 10 worst SNICK shows. And, okay, first of all, get rid of the picture. Get rid of it. Just go. Okay, good. If I want to tell you distinctively of what I think are the top 10 worst SNICK shows, I need to tell you face to face. I'm going to be telling you the shows that were the most abhorrent. The shows that just made you want to turn on the TV. You were all excited to see you with your friends on what shows are going to be on SNICK. Saturday night, this was the only time you could be able to watch it. And then you just sit down and you just look at the TV in disgust and wondering what the hell Nickelodeon is thinking of when showing this. Well, since we talked about the best, now we're about to talk about the worst. Get yourself a puke bag because we're going to dive down into the top 10 worst SNICK shows ever. So, right before we start off with the really crappy SNICK shows, like the ones that just make you want to have your eyes gouged out of your skull, we're going to be talking about the ones that were not bad, but fairly forgettable. So let's start off with number 10. Number 10 is The Mystery Files of Shelby Woo. Now, as I mentioned before in the Nickelodeon tribute, you can take a look at that in Manic Expression, Shelby Woo is not a bad show. If you don't know about it, Shelby Woo is basically a show about a young teenage girl, and she goes around solving mysteries. Fairly standard. The show is a bit monotonous and a tad bit repetitive, almost like the continuation series of Scooby-Doo like around the 70s and 80s. It didn't really change too much into it, but it kind of introduced the mystery genre for a new generation in the 90s, alongside with other shows such as Ghost Rider. Now, what made Shelby Woo a really unique show was that it came around the late 90s, so shows such as Clarissa Explains It All and The Secret World of Alex Mack were pretty much done. Shelby Woo was supposed to be like the next show that was supposed to showcase a new female protagonist for a new generation. Unfortunately, it came out around 98, which means that you had programs such as All That and Kenan and Kel. Shows like Mystery Files of Shelby Woo were pretty forgotten. And you can understand why. As I mentioned before in the top 10 SNICK shows, Kenan and Kel and All That were watched constantly. They couldn't get enough of Kenan and Kel and All That. It was hugely groundbreaking, hugely popular. So a show like Shelby Woo was kind of a product of the time. You know, a show about a girl solving mysteries. Nothing more to say about it. But what is one of the main highlights in Shelby Woo was that Pat Morita played the grandfather. He's awesome as usual. So for kids who didn't grow up and seen the original Karate Kid movies, they actually saw him in Shelby Woo. At least I think he did. I don't know. Overall, excuse me. Overall, Shelby Woo is not bad, but it's forgettable, which is why it's low on this list. Number 9 is going to go to another show that was not bad, but not great either. It could have been something really awesome if the Nickelodeon executives would have given them a chance, and that show is Space Cases. Now, Space Cases is actually the very first exclusive Nickelodeon sci-fi series. For people who don't know, Space Cases involved with 6 kids, each ranging from different planets and different species, and they all go to this space academy. And then one day a mysterious ship lands on the school, and then one of the kids, named Harlan, who's from planet Earth, who's played by Walter Jones, who most people know as the original Black Ranger from Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, he wanders into the spaceship. Everybody's following him, including the teachers, Davenport and Goddard. No, not Goddard from Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius, but there's a commander named Goddard. So basically, they wander into the space station / spaceship, or whatever you want to call it. Spaceship, yeah, spaceship. So they wander into the spaceship, it automatically starts, and then they're zoomed into space, and then they have to find a way to stop it, and then you have this robot android thing named Thelma, who's kind of like Alpha 5 from Power Rangers, except a lot more annoying, and not done by Richard Horvitz, which actually kind of made it fun, but still, anyway. So the way that they had to stop the ship was that they had to control it with their minds. So eventually they had to control it with their minds and they had to work together as a team. They stopped the ship, and then finally they realized that they went into like millions of years in hyperspace, and the only way they can get back is if they travel faster than the speed of light for about 7 years. So yeah, think of it like Star Trek meets with Lost in Space. And it's kind of interesting because the co-creator of Space Cases, Bill Mumy, was actually in both Lost in Space as the young kid Will Robinson, and he was in Babylon 5 as one of the main characters of the show. I don't remember, I haven't seen that show in a while. And the other co-creator, Peter David, was a writer on Babylon 5. So, yeah, the show is, if you watch the show and you are a little bit open to it, it's actually pretty interesting. The characters, some of them are pretty cool. I mean, you have the quarrel between Harlan and the Andromedan Radu, because Harlan's father was killed by the Andromedan War, and Radu is an Andromedan, so there's a little bit of prejudice in there, and Radu is feeling pain from the Andromedan War due to the fact that there's these evil alien species known as the Spungs who wanted to capture the Andromedans and make them their slaves. So it has a pretty nice, story behind it. And of course you had all the other characters in the show. You had my favorite character is Catalina. She is this really, really interesting person whom a lot of people thought she was crazy because she just basically talks with herself, basically like an imaginary friend named Susie, who turns out that Susie was not an imaginary friend. She just was invisible the entire time. It's complicated. Just watch the series. But yeah, surprisingly, Catalina was played by Jewel Staite. A lot of people known for playing that character from Firefly, which is pretty cool, actually. Now, and also, one more thing that I have to mention. The villain is played by George Takei. Awesome. Alright, so why is this show on the Worst SNICK series? Well, it came out in 96. 96 was the same year that Kenan and Kel came out. That's strike one. Strike two, low budget. And I mean really low budget. You look at the show now, it's kind of bad. I mean, it's trying to be a sci-fi series, a high technical sci-fi series, but you can see that there are a couple of things in it that it looks fake. Now take a couple of shows, for example, that have a low budget. Pete and Pete, for example. That show was able to work astonishingly well because of the writing and the characters. Sure, they didn't have like cool costumes that all the popular kids had, but then again, it wouldn't have fit the Pete and Pete theme of it trying to be like a realistic scenario of everyday kids. Now that makes sense. With Space Cases, on the other hand, it was trying to be like, taking place in space, having going to different planets and being around in the spaceship a lot. So it looked fake. Really fake. And third, this is the third strike, and this really kills me. The acting is atrocious. Acting is terrible. Like, really bad. Most of the kid actors, they are really wooden, and they don't portray their acting very well. It's laughably horrible. And also, some of the characters are not that very well developed. Like, you have this backstory with Goddard, and that at one point he was like a really high commander, and there was a couple of things that he did that he wasn't proud of, that pretty much demoted him. But the problem is, throughout the series, his story was never completed. The show was canceled around half of the second season, so we never really got a satisfying conclusion to whether they actually make it home. And also the characters were not as developed as they could have been. Some of the characters are really good, but others are not. And I think it's due to the terrible acting. Also, the writing is horrible. I mean, there are moments in which it's trying to portray itself as serious, but some of it is laughably bad. I mean, coupled with the really inconsistent stories and the bad acting, it just boils down to that Space Cases was not a good show to begin with. Although it has carried on as a cult classic. So yeah, Space Cases is low on this list is because, like I said, it's not a bad show. It's just that it was pretty short of what could have been. So I'm not gonna basically bash it. And like I said, it came out at the wrong place at the wrong time. All that and Kenan and Kel were like the top shows. So that's why Space Cases is nowadays forgotten, and that's why it is on my list as one of the worst SNICK shows of all time. Number 8. Now, this is going to be a show that many people may not actually remember, but this was actually one of the first shows that featured in the year 2000. And that show is No One Knows Best. Now, No One Knows Best is a show about a teenage boy named Noah, and he basically lives off his everyday teenage life, and he has a bunch of friends, and he has a family, and it takes place in New York City. Yeah, it's not really that interesting. In fact, this show is so bad that it was canceled in less than half a season. This show was canceled in less than 3 months. That's how bad it is. This is one of the shortest lasting Nickelodeon programs ever. It lasted less than My Brother and Me. Now, keep in mind, My Brother and Me is a pretty cheesy 90s show, and for No One Knows Best to last even less than that is pretty sad. Also, another thing that was pretty forgotten with No One Knows Best was that it was trying to be like Clarissa Explains It All. It tried to deal with the story about a regular teenage boy going through school and dealing with his family. That kind of storytelling was pretty much done with. This was 2000, and Clarissa Explains It All came out in 91. So No One Knows Best was a decade behind the ball. You had shows around the 2000s that were a lot more angsty, a lot more serious, like Dawson's Creek, and having a show like No One Knows Best was pretty dated by the time it came out. And the audience, they saw it. They saw it immediately. From the first episode, they knew that the show was not even going to last. And guess what? It didn't. I mean, you had 6 episodes that, you had 5 episodes that aired in No One Knows Best. And the last 3 didn't even air on Nickelodeon. So yeah, you only had 5 episodes of No One Knows Best that feature right before they decided to pull the plug. It was bad. And not just the fact that, the whole formula of a regular teenage boy going through things was bad, everything else was bad. The acting is terrible. The stories were tired. The characters were cliched. And when you're dealing with the storyline that everybody's already seen around the 90s, and everybody was trying to get into the 2000s where they were trying to forget the 90s, you have a show that nobody remembers, and for good reason. But they did feature No One Knows Best around SNICK for a short period of time, and then it was pretty much forgotten. Around the 2000s for SNICK, we'll talk about that in a minute, because trust me, I have a lot to say about that. Number 7. Now, number 7, this is going to be the final show on this list that is going to be considered not bad. The rest are downhill from here. And that goes to The Journey of Alan Strange. The Journey of Alan Strange was Thomas W. Lynch's second show that he created for Nickelodeon, and the first one being The Secret World of Alex Mack. Now, if you know Lynch's style, he's always writing realistic characters and realistic scenarios, but always giving it like a really interesting twist, with the exceptions of Caitlin's Way and Romeo. Now, with The Journey of Alan Strange, it's a show about an alien who lands on Earth for whatever reason that he does not even know about, and then he finds the Stevenson family who take him in, and he disguises himself as an African-American kid. Now, this might not be bad, but the fact that the Stevenson family happens to be white. Yeah, how are you going to explain that? You're a kid named Alan Strange. You're African-American, and you're with a white family, like unexpectedly. I have no idea why nobody questioned this. So, what makes The Journey of Alan Strange a not bad show? Well, There's one character who redeems it for me, and that is Robbie Stevenson. Robbie is a really interesting character. She's going through this really big dilemma of her parents being separated. And she's feeling the pain of having to take over the responsibilities of the mother because she's the only woman in the house now. She has a brother and she has a father. And you see a couple of episodes in which she's feeling sad, she wants her mother back, she's stressed out about raising her brother and taking care of the household because, let's be honest, this is part of the dumb parent thing that Nickelodeon has a reputation of doing. And I think Kevin Stevenson is one of the worst parents ever created. I mean, he's like a complete idiot. I am surprised that the mother wasn't able to have custody of the kids. Okay, I'm getting off topic. So yeah, Robbie's a really interesting character. And then when you have Alan in the mix, and he's an alien, he feels out of place, he misses his mother too, there's some great dynamics. The problem is that's rarely the case. Thomas W. Lynch, he based off of these experiences of his own childhood, of having numerous brothers and sisters and always being alone and left out. But he wanted to mix in some comedy to lighten everything up. The comedy is terrible. It's so awkward and so horribly meshed into the show that the Journey of Alan Strange doesn't know what it wants to be at this point. Is it trying to be serious? Is it trying to be a comedy? Is it trying to be an alien who lands on Earth and trying to fit in? It's a mess. Just from the moment that you watch it, it's a mess. The series finale is even worse. I'm not even going to go too deep into it because I already revealed what the series finale is in the Nickelodeon tribute reviewing The Journey of Alan Strange. So you can take a look at that. I don't even want to talk about it anymore. But yeah, overall, it's not a bad show. Scratch that. It is a bad show, but it has some good elements that was not implicated properly. So this is why I think that The Journey of Alan Strange is a bad SNICK show, and it's not too high on my list because it could have been great if they were to iron out the severe flaws and, Thomas W. Lynch trying to make it the show that he wanted it to be without being, too dark and serious. But other than that, don't even bother watching this show. It's really, really bad. I mean, it's not bad like the ones that are on this list, but it's pretty bad to not watch. This show is not recommended to check out. Alright, number 6. Now we're about to deal into the bad shows, but not just yet. We're going to deal into the bad, forgettable shows. The next one on this list is 100 Deeds for Eddie McDow. You probably already heard me talking about this show on the top 10 Nickelodeon shows of... No, I'm sorry. Scratch that. You probably remember me talking about Eddie McDow in the top 20 through 11 Nickelodeon shows that should be remade. And I already reviewed Eddie McDow, so you can check that out if you want. So Eddie McDow is about a bully named Eddie, and he's basically pushing everybody around, and he's constantly being mean to people. And then you have this one instance in which he picks on somebody, and it turns out to be a man known as the Drifter. Now, the Drifter turns Eddie into a dog, and for him to be a kid again, he has to do 100 good deeds. And the only way he can be able to speak to somebody is the last person he picked on, a boy named Justin. He's the only one who understands him, basically. And Justin adopts Eddie and brings him into his family. This show is bland without comparison. This show is really, really forgettable. The characters are extremely boring and one-dimensional. You have Justin, who's supposed to be like the main protagonist. He's supposed to be the kid who's constantly being picked on. And he, takes in Eddie and he learns a little bit about him. But Justin is boring. There's really nothing special about him. And the kid who portrayed as Justin, he didn't do any other acting since. And I can see why. When you have a show such as Eddie McDow as like on top of your IMDb, you know that you're not going to go far. And then also you have the parents. Now, parents in Nickelodeon can either be goofy or they can be bland. These have got to be probably the blandest parents I've ever seen in my life. There is literally no personality in them whatsoever. The mom is just the mom and the dad is just the dad. That's it. Nothing. It's not like with Clarissa Explains It All, in which the dad is goofy and the mom is trying to cook really healthy, organic vegetarian meals for the kids, and she's really smart, she gives great advice, and the parents are not like the ones in The Adventures of Pete and Pete, in which the father is really serious and has a love for fishing and driving and his lawn, and then you have the mom who has the plate in her head and she's very loving and supportive. No, these parents suck. They suck. And then you have the sister. Yeah, just the sister, the sassy sister. The sister who's like, oh, I can push you around because you're the younger brother and I'm the boss. That's it. In fact, she was so bland that she was only in for one season, and then afterwards she was gone. Around season 2 and 3, never mentioned again. So then we have the replacement for the sister, which is this foreign exchange student who comes all the way from England, who has a terrible British accent. And yeah, she's just as bland as the sister. The only thing that stands her out is that she has a fake British accent. And then you have the best friend. And interestingly enough, it was the same girl who was London on The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody. She actually did start on Nickelodeon before going to there. And you know what? Nothing special about her. She's just the best friend. That's it. But if you want to talk about bland best friends to the main protagonist, stick around for. Okay, I'm sorry. Scratch that. If you want to talk about bland best friends to bland main protagonist, meet me at number 2, because I got a lot to say about that. But the only characters who are memorable in this show was the Drifter and Eddie. Now, the Drifter is played by Richard Moore, and Richard Moore, anything he's in it, he's good. And then you have Eddie, the dog. Eddie was played by 2 people. In season 1, he was played by Seth Green. In seasons 2 and 3, he was played by Jason Harvey. You probably know him as Wayne from The Wonder Years. Now, Eddie, he's actually a really interesting character, but he wasn't implicated well enough. He's a bully, and he turns into a dog and he has to do good deeds. But by the time that he turns into a dog, he has like a 180 with his personality. Instead of him being like a mean dog who struggles to be good, he's like a laid-back, cool kind of dog. Why? Why couldn't he be mean? Why couldn't he start off the series with biting people or chasing people or something like that? But no, I mean, he's just almost good by the time he turns into a dog, and he just starts making trouble. There's a difference between being a troublemaker and being a bully. I don't think that the executives got that. In fact, I don't think anybody cared about this show. I don't think they gave... I mean, with 100 Deeds Freddie McDow, I don't think even the Nickelodeon executives gave a shit about it. Around season 2, instead of having the opening theme song with, exposition of what the plot is, because you know that when you're watching the show, you don't even care... They replaced it with Who Let the Dogs Out by the Baha Men. It was that bad. And you know what? Nobody watched it. It was forgotten. It was basically pushed on the side with shows such as All That, Kenan and Kel, and The Amanda Show. Nobody gave a shit about it. It was canceled in around 40 episodes. And Eddie never turned back into human. And nobody gives a shit. Okay, so number 5, we're about to get into the really bad ones. And I mean really bad ones. We're going to talk about one of the first SNICK shows that ever was released, Roundhouse. I know I'm going to get a ton of hate mail and a ton of bad comments and dislikes from this video by me mentioning Roundhouse. I know that there's actually a few people out there who like Roundhouse, and they think it's an underrated Nickelodeon show. No. Let me tell you what an underrated Nickelodeon show is. An underrated Nickelodeon show is supposed to be a show that is just as good as the mainstream shows, but was never given the praise that it deserved when it first came out, and it wasn't given the viewers that it deserved when it first came out. Let me give you an example of a good underrated Nickelodeon show. The Adventures of Pete and Pete is a good underrated Nickelodeon show. Kablam is a good underrated Nickelodeon show. The Angry Beavers is a good underrated Nickelodeon show. Invader Zim, Caitlin's Way, As Told by Ginger, Ned's Declassified, Cat Scratch, The Secret Show, and even to an extent, Tough Puppy and, what's that other one? I even forget it. House of Anubis, there we go. House of Anubis. Those are underrated Nickelodeon shows. And also Brain Surge is an underrated Nickelodeon show. Roundhouse is just garbage. Pure 90s garbage. Now, Roundhouse is a sketch comedy show that featured on SNICK when it first came out. This was the first sketch comedy show. Of course, if you don't want to count shows like Welcome Freshmen, to be exact. But yeah, before all that, Roundhouse came out. And to tell you the truth, Roundhouse is an atrocious mess. Everything about it sucks. Now, I know it was trying to be like the whole improv thing in which they basically just acted on the spot. There's little to no props. And also, the cast was over bloated. There was just so many people there. You didn't even know their names most of the time. They were that forgettable. When you take a look back at all the other sketch comedy shows that featured on Nickelodeon, such as All That and Out of Control, and You Can't Do That on Television, you actually know their names. They had skits that were memorable. They had consistent skits that would show up all the time. With Roundhouse, it was like, we have something different. We're going to have like a main theme in the show, like You Can't Do That on Television. And we're going to be able to just do whatever the fuck. Yeah, that's just going to be extremely inconsistent. Also, the jokes were too quick. You didn't get the joke? Don't worry. Just wait 10 seconds and we'll do another joke. You didn't get that? We'll just do another 10 seconds. You didn't get that? Oh, dance sequence and singing. Rinse and repeat. And that is an episode of Roundhouse. And this show lasted for 3 years. I have no idea how they lasted this long. Because, to be quite honest, most people hated this show when it first came out. Even the Nickelodeon executives hated this show when it first came out. They didn't care about Roundhouse. They were more preoccupied with trying to reach on to the audience of all the popular shows. You had Clarissa Explains It All. You had The Ren and Stimpy Show. You had Are You Afraid of the Dark? Those were the ones that everybody was watching. Roundhouse was just like that little cousin that comes from an uncle that you haven't seen in 20 years, that you don't even remember about, and he shows up at the family reunion, and you think he was just some kid who lives next door that just got lost along the way. Pretty sad. I even tried to watch an episode of Roundhouse like 2 weeks ago when people were complaining that, oh, Snickiversary's not going to have Roundhouse, it's instead going to have All That. After 5 minutes, I just shut it off. I couldn't take it anymore. I was having a headache. So bottom line, I'm sorry for people who like this show. Maybe someday James will do a Stop the Hate on Roundhouse, which I doubt. But other than that, yeah. This is a show that many people have forgotten, and it should stay that way. Alright, now we get to number 4. And number 4 is actually one of the last shows that featured on SNICK right before it was pretty much gone for good. And that is Romeo. Romeo, believe it or not, is actually one of the first teen sitcoms that featured a celebrity. Now, I'm not talking about like shows like Kenan and Kel or Drake and Josh or anything like that. I mean, sure, they were celebrities, but there were celebrities that were established in other Nickelodeon shows. Romeo, on the other hand, was a celebrity in his own right. I mean, he was a singer, he appeared on You Pick Live, Slimetime Live a couple of times, so he was already an established celebrity. And with that, they decided to give him his own show because the kids were just getting into him. This show is another example of just bland, boring, marketable, manipulative sitcoms that seem to dominate these kind of shows nowadays. You have Romeo, and the whole point of the show is that he's trying to convince his dad, Master P, the record dealer, of him having a hip-hop band with his brothers and sisters. That's it. Oh yeah, and of course you have like some, instances in which they go to school and they learn lessons and stuff. But other than that, it's really not much to say. Everybody is boring. I mean, you have the siblings, you have the little brother who's like the little brother, and the sister, once again, is the sassy older sister. And then you have the dad who's, once again, he's Master P, and he's supposed to be like the record dealer who says no because life in Hollywood is so hard and, you can't make it big and blah, 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 whatever. Other than that, it just feels like a little bit hypocritical because you're a record dealer and you did music at one point, and I'm sure you probably had the same conversation with your parents, and yet you did it anyway. You know that it's going to happen anyway, that these kids are going to get themselves their own record deal. What's the point? And then, of course, you have Lewis. Lewis could have been a really interesting character. Now, as I mentioned before, Thomas W. Lynch co-created this show alongside with Master P and somebody else that I don't care about. This was the last show that he created for Nickelodeon. I mean, of course, if you don't want to count the end, but let's be honest, nobody watched the end when it first came out because almost nobody had it on their channels or their cable network or whatever. So I'm not going to count those. Now, I have a really strong feeling that Thomas W. Lynch actually created Lewis and not Master P. I doubt that Master P could create something this decent. You see, Lewis is a white kid who lives with a black family. He's a foster kid who went from foster home to foster home to foster home, and he never really felt that he belongs with the Miller family because he's a foster kid. He wasn't fully adopted until later on throughout the series. But other than that, you see a couple of episodes in which he's struggling to maintain his status as a family member, and then you have one episode in which one of the foster brothers shows up and invites him over to stay with him, and he decides on it, and he says no because he feels safe with the Miller family, and blah, 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 blah. I think that they should have really implicated Lewis as a much more prominent character because there's a lot of good things about him. Lewis almost kind of reminds me of Caitlin from Caitlin's Way, in which she's an orphan, and she's gone from foster home to foster home to foster home, and then eventually she goes over to this orphanage, like orphanage/Catholic school or whatever, and then eventually she goes over to live with her mother's cousin, and she starts struggling to fit in. You already know about this on my top 10 SNICK shows, so I'm not going to get into much details, but unfortunately, Lewis is just a throwaway character. I mean, that's the only time in which there's actually drama in this show. If you would have kicked Lewis out, it would have probably just been another generic sitcom. And there's another thing that makes this show sort of stand out, and that is Victoria Taylor as one of the minor characters who plays as this nanny. She's only around for the first season, and she was actually kind of humorous. She's a nanny who doesn't know how to cook, clean, or take care of children, or do homework. So Master P hired a pretty much worthless nanny. But at least she was funny. Yeah. She was actually the main highlight of the show. She was one of the main highlights of the show, but she was pretty much worthless. I think they actually got the memo because around season 2 she was pretty much gone. But unfortunately they replaced her with Angela, who is supposedly Master P's girlfriend, and then she becomes married to them, and then there's like this whole, oh, we don't like you because you're our dad's girlfriend, and then you're the stepmom, and why is it when it comes to every show featuring an evil stepmother, she has to be evil? Don't do that. Just don't do that. Seriously, don't do that. And to tell you the truth, there's nothing bad about her. But then again, there's nothing to her. She's boring and bland, just like most of the people on this show. This is a show that really feels manipulative. It was like, oh, we're going to try to craze in on Romeo's popularity. It didn't work. The show has been out around like 10 years ago, and nobody even remembers it. If you don't have a show with substance, like memorable characters, relatable situations, humor, maybe even some decent music from time to time, your Romeo, you could have done some decent songs, but other than that, yeah, there's a reason why nobody remembers this show. I mean, it was done for the wrong reasons, and that's why it's pretty up there on my list. All right, so number 3. Okay, number 3 is another All That spinoff that tried to, craze in on the whole popularity that happened beforehand with Kenan and Kel and The Amanda Show, and they worked out really well. This one, on the other hand, it did not, and that is The Nick Cannon Show. This is when the All That spin-offs were starting to become bad. Like Nick Cannon Show and Just Jordan. Okay. Enough of that. So yeah, the Nick Cannon Show is supposed to be about Nick Cannon traveling around from place to place, and he's going to change everything to make it in his own rules and his own style. Nick Cannon takes over your school. Nick Cannon takes over your auditorium. Nick Cannon takes over this and that. I don't care. Nick Cannon is not really a funny guy. If he was humorous, it was because he was surrounded by other funny people. Excuse me. I have an itch. Now, let's just take a good sitcom from the later seasons of All that utilized Nick Cannon to his advantage. The Convenience Store skit. This was kind of like their version of Good Burger without Kel Mitchell in it. So Kenan Thompson and Nick Cannon played like these really sassy African-American women who run a convenience store, and the customers come in and they're like all sassy and stuff, and they basically just do everything so hilariously. It may be stereotypical for an African-American woman to do these kind of things, but I thought it worked. I thought it was pretty funny. But it was funny because Kenan Thompson was pretty much pulling in the weight of this. Without Nick Cannon there, I think Kenan Thompson and somebody else could have done it. I mean, sure, you didn't have a lot of African-Americans in this season, with the exception of Nick Cannon, but anybody else could have done it. So, yeah, if without that point with Nick Cannon being in his own show, he felt like he needed somebody else to make him funny. And also, I don't understand why Nick Cannon had his own show. Anybody could have been, anybody could have had their own show, and it would have been just as good. If you were talking about the revival, you could have had Lisa Boyles had her own show. Jack DeSena could have had his own show. Kyle Sullivan could have had his own show. Chelsea Brummett could have had her own show. All those people could have had their own show. And if you're talking about people from season 6, Gabriel Iglesias. Done. I bet you're basically laughing at yourselves now, Comedy Central. You actually know how to use Gabriel Iglesias to his advantage. And I'm sure that Nickelodeon is crying themselves over that. Instead of having him on the show, they instead to have Nick Cannon. And also, it happens to have one of the worst opening theme songs of all time. You already know about this on my top 10 worst Nickelodeon theme songs. Check it out on the blog if you want to, but be warned, your ears will bleed, and your head will shake in embarrassment, and you will just basically go in and rage. Those are the symptoms of a bad Nickelodeon theme song. Number 2, and this is the big one. This is the huge one. This is the one that got me irritated, angry, outraged, just flat out pissed off. Number 2 is Cousin Skeeter. This is, in my opinion, the worst, count it, worst Nickelodeon sitcom that featured in the 90s. Everything about it is horrible. The acting is horrible. The characters are horrible. The scenario is tired. The episodes are forgettable. Everything about it is horrible. Where do I begin? Okay, so basically you have this. You have a regular family, and all of a sudden, a little puppet named Skeeter, who is apparently a family member, comes by to stay with them for a while. And then you have the main protagonist, whose name is Bobby, and he's watching over Skeeter, and Skeeter causes trouble constantly. And then Bobby, alongside with his best friend Nina, they try to basically follow Skeeter around and fix the problem, and then they end up learning a big lesson. And then they do the same thing again, and again, and again, and again, and again. Now, remember when I said that the friend from 100 Deeds Freddie McDow is boring and that the main protagonist was boring? Cousin Skeeter is even worse, if you can believe it. Robert Richard's portrayal as Bobby. So horribly bland. Horrifically bland. I mean, if you were to compare Justin from 100 Deeds Freddie McDow and Bobby from Cousin Skeeter, at least Justin had Eddie, who was an interesting character and had an interesting synopsis, but, you know, that was bad. So let's just call Justin Vanilla Ice Cream. Bobby has Skeeter, and he needs Skeeter to overcompensate the fact that there's nothing special about him. Bobby is tofu. Tofu without the flavor. Tofu with no mirin, with no soy sauce, with no ginger or garlic or any of those things that make it delicious. Bobby is forgettable. Just cut Bobby off of the show and nothing would change. And then you have Nina. You thought that the friend from Eddie McDowd was bad and boring? Nina almost has no purpose whatsoever. Apparently Bobby has some sort of crush on her or something, but Nina is not needed. I mean, you have Bobby there trying to fix Skeeter's problems, and Nina's just there for the ride. Just cut Nina off the show and nothing would change. And then you have the parents. Oh my God, these parents. These parents are not as bland as the ones in Eddie McDowd, but my God. They are so bland and so forgettable. They're like a piece of paper. A piece of blank paper with nothing on it. That's pretty much the parents of Cousin Skeeter in a nutshell. And now you have the worst thing in the entire show. Skeeter himself. Wow. Just wow. Skeeter is so annoying. He is loud. He is crass. He is rude. He is obnoxious. He is so unbelievably horrible. He's a terrible role model for kids. He screws everything up. He's rude. He's crass. And he basically is the one who causes all the problems. But however, if you were to take Skeeter off the show, you would just have a show based off of an African-American family who do nothing. It's almost like My Brother and Me, except 10 times worse. I have really nothing to say about it except for one question. Why is it that out of everybody in this show, why is Skeeter the only puppet in this show and everybody else is normal? Now, if you were to have multiple characters as puppets and they were to interact with one another, kind of like the Muppets, that would make sense. And also, there's another show on Disney XD called Crash and Bernstein. As much as that show is terrible, and I think it's supposed to be like the next generation Cousin Skeeter, at least it makes sense on the puppet's backstory. You know, the kid, he was wishing for the puppet to come to life because he had no other friends. Yeah, that makes sense. In a weird way. Sort of like Cousin Skeeter meets Ted. Ugh. Okay, I'm back. So yeah, overall, Cousin Skeeter, horrible, horrible show. Definitely one of the worst shows I've ever seen in my life. The worst show to come out in the 90s for Nickelodeon, and it deserves to be at the top of this list. However, it's not number one. What is number one? The answer may be a bit controversial, but I think it deserves it to be this way because we're talking about SNICK shows. We're talking about the shows that defined SNICK. Now, this show, when it came out again, point that out again, SNICK was pretty much dead. I'll explain in a minute. Number 1 goes to All That. Now wait, don't turn off the video. You probably are saying to yourself, wait a minute, you already had All That on number 1 of the best SNICK shows. What are you talking about? I'm not talking about the original All That. I'm talking about the revision of All That. The All That revival era from 2002 to 2005. I'm talking about seasons 7 through 10. That is number 1 on my list. Now you might be thinking I'm hypocritical, because if you recall from my top 10 Nickelodeon shows that deserve more love and less hate, All That is actually number 1 on my list. The revival era is on number 1 because a lot of people hate it. A lot of people say that it's not as good as the original, that this show shouldn't have been made. It should have had the original cast members because they were just fine. Here's a problem. The revival era of All That needed to happen. Around season 6, everybody was getting tired of All That. Everybody was worn out. Some of the cast members who were included into the show were not as funny. And also some of the skits were not as classic. So basically the show was canceled around 2000. When the original All That was canceled in 2000, SNICK was officially dead. You have around this time period of dark, I'm sorry, restart that again. Around 2000, it was pretty much the dark ages for SNICK. For the next 2 years, most people were turned off by SNICK. Around 2000, when All That was gone, when Kablam was gone, when Are You Afraid of the Dark was gone, when Kenan and Kel was gone, all these classic SNICK shows were gone. It had nothing to do but to basically just try to make itself stay alive. They thought that the Amanda Show was going to be the one to make it stand out, but unfortunately it wasn't even enough. So you had this period in which Nickelodeon started to change their schedules around. You had Nick Flicks, which basically is like showing a couple of episodes or a TV movie, and then around 9:30, you would feature the Brothers Garcia. Now, you'll probably already know about me discussing about the Brothers Garcia. I already reviewed it on the blog. But the Brothers Garcia, although it may be groundbreaking by being the very first show done by Hispanics in an American channel, there's really not much to say about it. It's actually pretty basic and generic. And then, of course, you had all the other programs. You had Caitlin's Way, you had Taina, you had basically a lot of these shows that were featured for girls, which I mentioned in the last video. That was not Nickelodeon's demographic at the time. Nickelodeon's demographic at the time were teenage boys. So you had The Amanda Show, Caitlin's Way, and Taina at the top. And that was pretty much a huge no-no. Since the main demographic at the time was teenage boys, this was when SNICK was going even lower in the ratings. And then you had the revival of All That come back around 2002. Nothing was the same afterwards. You had 2 years of pretty much nothing for SNICK. Not even the revival era of All That could save it. They tried. They really tried. They had a fresh cast. They had new jokes. But nobody was getting into it. Nobody. They hated it. Even still to this day, people hated it. However, it still was very important for SNICK to do this. Because, as you know, for a lot of people who grew up in the 2000s, the revival era of All That was the first SNICK show that they ever saw. So it was kind of needed, but still, the new generation just couldn't hold a candle to the old ones. After the revival era is when the crap came in. You had the Nick Cannon Show, you had Romeo, you had Cousin Skeeter reruns, you had All Grown Up, you had Romeo, you had, all these things that try to salvage it, but it just didn't work. And then you had the SNICK On Air Dare. This was probably one of the most embarrassing things I've ever seen in my life. For all you kids out there who are complaining about, Nick Studio 10 is the worst sketch comedy show of all time. They wasted food. They had lame jokes like fart in a jar and all that Bullshit. I can't agree that Nick Studio 10 is bad, but imagine this. Did Nick Studio 10 had a dare that involved with dunking your head in the toilet to bob for apples? Did Nick Studio 10 had a dare in which you had to shave your principal's legs? Did Nick Studio 10 had a dare for you to eat a gallon full of blue cheese? Did Nick Studio 10 had a dare of you clipping off toenails? No, it did not. This was embarrassing. Just horrifically embarrassing. You had like the newer cast members of All That trying to do this Snick on air dare, and people were calling in on their phones for them to do like the stupidest things you would ever see. They were trying to copy off of the popularity of Fear Factor, and it failed miserably. This was when Snick was dead to them. Even though that Snick was able to stay for a couple of more years, ending its run in 2004, it was no use. From the moment that All That was gone, Snick was gone. And one of the first shows that tried to salvage that was the All That revival era. And that is why it's number 1 on my list. Now let me ask you guys this. What shows do you feel that were the most horrific shows that featured on Snick? Was it a show that was mentioned on my list? Or maybe it was a show that was not mentioned on my list? Post in the comments below and let me know. Until then, this has been Patricia from Old School Lane and Manic Expression. I hope to see you soon. Take care.